Thank you for the invitation to speak here today to all of you about the Shell LNG outlook of 2019. Hopefully some interesting trends and forecasts that to share that will hopefully be a good platform for further, fruitful discussion between ourselves afterwards. My lawyers asked me to show the slide, and I will summarize it as saying that despite the fact that I'm talking about the future, I don't have a crystal ball, so please don't rely on it in terms of your personal investment strategies, but use your own judgment. Okay, all right, so last year when we published the 2018 LNG outlook, we talked about a few things. Namely about how the external environment was creating more opportunities for gas and LNG. About how at that time most people felt that the LNG growth in demand, particularly that had been seen in Asia in 2017, was considered to be not sustainable by the external market, and about the medium-term need of more LNG supply investment. So that was kind of the context a year ago. And so let's see now first maybe how that has worked out in the year since then in 2018. Before I do so though, let's remind ourselves of the various factors that are at play right now in terms of the global energy challenge, as we call it, and as we often refer to as the energy transition that is happening as we speak and will continue to evolve over the years and decades to come. If we start on the left-hand side of this chart, first looking at the growing population leading to growing energy demand. If you look at the World Bank's projections, they say that by 2050 we will have close to 10 billion people in this world, which is more than 2.5 billion more than we have today. This growth is not just in terms of population, but also the economic growth that people will be seeing, as many people are going to be enjoying what the expectation is, improving living standards and moving from lower to middle class income and parts of the economy. All this together is even if you take into account energy efficiency, is expected to lead to a 50% increase in energy between now and 2070, so in the next 50 years. A second trend that's related to that is urbanization. So cities currently consume about 3/4 of global primary energy demand and emit more than half of the world's greenhouse gases. And cities are expected by the middle of this century to constitute 2/3 of the world's population, which is up from 50% today. So that's changed from 50% to 2/3 is another large kind of global trend that we see happening. If we then move to the right-hand side of this chart, starting with climate change, I think for 3 years between 2015, 16 and 17, the world saw a plateauing of CO2 global emissions, where they had stayed flat. But then in the year after that, we saw a rise of more than 500 million tons in the global emissions of CO2. If you actually look at the aspirations that the world has defined in whether it is the Paris Agreement or to limit the rise to, say, a global increase of 2 degrees Celsius only in the world, it actually means that CO2 emissions will have to drop between now and 2040 to meet those goals. So you there have the contrasting trends of needing more energy whilst at the same time needing less CO2 emissions in an absolute sense, not only in a relative per unit volume sense. And then the other one that's on the right-hand side that I think has particularly become maybe more obvious to the whole world in the last few years is the issue of air quality, which now affects millions of people around the world. One maybe particular data point that's on this slide that I would like to call out is that the World Health Organization estimates that 7 million people die of what they call premature deaths every year as a result of both outside as well as indoor air pollution. Now, if we talk about indoor health pollution, then There's also the need of, as I said earlier, bringing people out of poverty and into energy security. According to the IEA, by 2030, there will still be 650 million people in this world that have little or no access to electricity, and more than 2 billion people that rely on cooking with solid fuels, so biomass. So this is either things such as cow dung or wood and pieces of wood that they gather around where they live, which is one of the large contributors to the indoor air pollution, household air pollution, that is still leading to very many premature deaths, particularly in children and elderly people. So then you get to the middle of this chart, and to meet the rising global demand for energy, whilst also avoiding the serious consequences of climate change and air pollution, a transformation of the energy system is required across the whole energy spectrum. So electricity generation, industry, transport, heating and cooling of buildings. Natural gas is expected to be a critical component of that energy transition and is expected to meet increasing demand whilst also lowering global greenhouse gas emissions, and has the ability to improve air quality. Our expectation is, and you see here also some of the other parties from which we've taken forecasts, is that a combination of natural gas and renewables will account for about 70% of the energy growth over the next 20 years, with gas having the largest share of that growth. So in an absolute sense, we actually believe most of the energy demand growth to be met by gas, although in a percentage basis, renewable is growing faster, but the absolute sense will still most of that demand growth will be met by gas. Despite this growth, if you look at the right-hand side of this chart, gas still remains underweight in many regions. The global average share of gas is 23%, so getting close to a quarter. But you actually see that every region other than North America still has a lower share. Places like India and China have made a lot of progress in increasing the amount of gas in the energy mix, but you can also see that they still, compared to other regions, have a large potential in terms of further improvements. They have both publicly stated some quite large ambitions and aspirations, where the Indian government aspiration is to take their share of gas to 15% by 2035, and China has actually set an ambition to reach 10% of the energy mix already by next year, so by 2020. It's not just India and China, but just a few other examples of what is happening around the world right now in terms of government policies that are explicitly recognizing the benefits of natural gas and encouraging the use of natural gas for a cleaner energy mix. You see here examples of tax schemes in Korea that favor the use of gas over coal. You see a very strong central government directed policy in China, which I just talked about, with clear targets per year that are being pursued and met. And another example in Europe, which may be using more of a market-based mechanism, but you can see the policy changes leading to an increased carbon pricing over the years, which very clearly is also driving the use of more and more gas over alternatives such as coal in Europe. So another maybe important factor is because often when we think about gas versus maybe other energy sources, the public in particular tends to think very quickly of power and electricity. But actually when you look at the last 2 years of growth from 2016 to 2018, the majority of gas demand growth has actually come from the non-power sector. So from industry and from residential and commercial demand and transport. So although gas and renewables will more naturally compete for market share in the electricity generation, the majority of this non-power gas demand comes from sectors that are harder to decarbonize and where gas, we really feel, will have to play the critical role both today as well as in the future. Now, if we then look within that gas demand, so most of it is what I've been talking about to date, is specifically about gas as a whole. And we then look specifically at LNG or other sources. We still believe that if you look forward in the next 17 years, that the highest increase in gas demand will be met by domestic production in various countries around the world. But that the second of that is expected to be from LNG imports, and that they will account about 34% of the global gas demand. The overall trends in terms of annual growth are unchanged compared to a year ago, where we still expect an annual compounded growth rate of 2% for global gas demand per year, 3% in Asia, and overall 4% compounded annual growth rate of LNG demand per year. And that's clearly because of the fact that LNG is starting from a lower base today than, for example, domestic or pipeline trade. Particularly LNG imports in South Asia. So Northeast Asia has been the traditional strong market for LNG, but South Asia is expected to triple during this time period, the demand driven first of all by India, but also by Pakistan and Bangladesh, which are supplementing more and more in the future their declining domestic gas production by LNG. So in addition to some of the traditional markets of LNG where we see growth, I also wanted to highlight some new sources of energy, sources of LNG growth. First of all, in terms of geographies, and secondly, in terms of usage. So the number of countries importing LNG are continuing to increase, and countries are really looking, if we talk to policymakers in these countries, they're choosing LNG because it provides a secure, affordable, and clean energy, and it is that combination of those three factors that attracts them to LNG. As mentioned, the one on the left, Bangladesh, it's really about a declining domestic gas production, which declines slowly in the years ahead, and they want to fill that gap with LNG imports. Panama, you really see it's about complementing renewable power generation, and in Panama's case, that is hydro energy, but which is very seasonal and also varies not only from year to year, but also within the year, and they want to complement that with LNG and displace what is liquid fuels generations, what they've been using in the past, mainly diesel. And Gibraltar, a small country that has in the past been dependent on a standalone diesel-generated electricity grid that has also switched over to LNG in terms of replacing diesel for its power generation in that country. So as I mentioned, also looking a little bit more about, and Vitaly mentioned this in his trends as well, about different usage of LNG trends that we see happening already today and increasing in the future. Transportation as a whole represents about a third of global energy demand. So when we talk about the total usage of energy at the start of my presentation, about a third of that is for transport today. Half of that third is for heavy trucks and marine fuels. The other half being made up by either what we tend to call light mobility, so small passenger and personal cars, or things like airline. Even with significant energy efficiency improvements in the transport demand sector, by 2060 it's still expected to increase by 50% compared to today's levels. And transport today is responsible for about a quarter of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and particularly in cities it also is a big contributor to poor air quality. These are all, I think, very clear reasons why LNG use, or why the world in the transport sector is more and more looking towards the use of LNG. So on this slide you particularly see some of the factors associated with road transport. China has already been traditionally the leader in this market. Last year road transport in China consumed almost 7 million tons in 2018. So that alone makes up about 70% of, could in itself represents the same as about 70% of the demand of the Sakhalin 2 LNG plant. And by the end of 2018, there were 340,000 LNG vehicles on the road, both trucks and buses, that refuel regularly at about 2,500 LNG fueling stations across China. If you look at Europe, today there are only, compared to China, I should say only, but there are already 5,000 LNG trucks on the road, and this is expected to, in the next 10 years, to grow quite rapidly to more than 250,000 LNG trucks. To do this, across Europe, countries are working together to set up a network of pan-European sites. The aspiration is defined as ensuring that there is going to be one LNG fueling station at least every 400 kilometers on every major road artery across Europe. So going from the Netherlands to Italy or from Spain to Russia. And our company in particular is also supporting that development with retail stations, LNG fueled retail stations that we've opened up in the Netherlands, in Belgium and in Germany so far. Next, let's have a look at marine. Ships today already transport about 90% of world trade, and they also generate about 3% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions. The biggest portion of these emissions happen within 400 kilometers of coastal communities, highly concentrated around the areas of Eastern Asia, South Asia and Europe. Compared to the traditional marine fuels, so liquid-based marine fuels, natural gas combustion provides 90% less particulates, virtually no sulfur dioxide, which obviously is a contributant to things such as acid rain. You can see that the demand for LNG as marine fuel is, in the last few years, has been increasing rapidly. Partially also due to the IMO emission reduction requirements that should cap the content of sulfur to less than 0.5% starting from 2020. LNG is an obvious and probably the easiest way to meet that requirement, and not only will it allow vessels and companies to meet that requirement, but also be almost immediately poised to meet what is very likely to be the next stage of requirement to come in past 2020. By 2030, we expect the global demand for LNG as a fuel for marine transport to reach about 20 million tons per year, and another 35 million tons by 2035. So those numbers are already more than the total supply of Russian LNG that Vitaly also showed earlier. We see already a huge step change just in the last few years. By the end of 2018, there were already almost 300 LNG fueled vessels on the water, everything from crude tankers to container vessels to ferry ships and to cruise liners, all floating around and traveling around the world using LNG. Let's have a little bit of a look at the supply side. A lot of what I've been talking about so far is the demand side. If you look at the supply side in 2018, and you look at the right-hand side of this chart, we see now that what we call the first wave of LNG growth post-Fukushima, which was really one of the impetuses for the current growth in LNG supply that we see. We see that about 70% of that was already online by the end of 2018. And you can see also that the majority of that remainder will come on stream this year, with then 90% of that wave already having been completed. That wave added about 37 million tons of new liquefaction capacity in 2018. But if you incorporate also the decline of existing projects, so many other projects that are either running out of their own gas supply and declining, the net increase in the supply was only 27 million tons in 2018. The total delivered volume surpassed 300 million tons in 2018, which pretty much doubled over the last 10 years when the market was still below 170 million tons just 10 years ago. This year, the expectation of growth is 35 million tons in 2019, and in 2020 is expected to be 29 million tons of increase in demand. And you see here, those two numbers I just mentioned are demand, and you see the red capacity additions coming on in the next in 2019 and 2020. So already in both years, less than demand growth that is expected in those 2 years. In 2018, we also saw, and you heard me say earlier that the market expectation was very much that demand was not going to be able to catch up with all the increase in supply that was coming from these new projects. I think that what we saw is that again in 2018 the market grew by 27 million tons. So this is the demand side, whereas the global consensus of experts at the start of 2018 was only for 20 million tons. So more than a third increase in demand versus market expectations. This is from a strong pull from Asia, and I think that's important. If we look at this next slide, the market consensus at the start of the year was the gray bars that you see here, and they were especially expecting that a lot of the volumes would end up in Europe, and Europe is often seen as the flexible home for volumes, all on a price basis. So that's seen as more of a supply push, where volumes have to look for a market. They can go to Europe, but then often have to compete against lower prices and push the prices down on the continent. What we saw happening in 2018, that actually the market pulled them to Asia, to where higher prices are available in the market. And actually, as you look at the yellow bars across the European continent, they represented only relatively small increases in demand across Europe. One of the other strong trends that we saw in 2018 and continue this year and going forward is the expansion of the LNG spot market. About 30% of the market in 2018 was traded on a spot basis. Just to give you an idea, that means that every day about 4 LNG cargoes are being loaded and sold on a spot basis. Particularly in China, the amount of spot trade doubled in 2018. But I think this is not only an Asian trend that we were seeing, but as you can see from the middle chart, also the amount of spot trade happening in the European continent saw a lot of growth, particularly if you look across the last 2 to 3 years. So that was looking back and maybe seeing the trends in 2018 and where the market again surprised expectations. So let's look forward now at 2019 as well as the next few years. As you can see from the chart on the left, most of the incremental volumes this year in 2019 are expected to come from the US. And it is expected to add about 17 million tons of additional supply growth in 2019. If you look then on the right-hand side, the last 2 years, the market consensus was that a lot of those volumes would end up going to Europe as the balancing market, and I think that is the expectation again for 2019. Although it didn't happen in 17 and 18, in 19 that is the projection, and I think if we just look at the last 4 to 5 months, then that trend has been more on par with expectation in 2019 than it has been in 17 and 18. And that, I think, is largely due to what it's been, is what Vitaly showed as well earlier already, less demand in 2019, or at least the first half of 2019 in Asia, driven by what has been a warmer winter in most places, but also driven in places such as China, where there really, in some areas of the country, was a supply crisis in the winter before, and the government drove more proactive supply build-up in terms of stocks for this winter, and that combined with what was a warm winter really led to lower prices in Asia, and therefore that pull of high prices and pulling the volumes to Asia didn't happen to the same degree, and many more of the volumes in the last few months have been going to Europe. The market expectation is that the amount of European LNG import is going to be quite high, an average of 70% of the overall energy supply of 35 million tons is expected to go to Europe, as you can see on this chart. So let's zoom in a little bit in Europe and what we see there in terms of the overall supply demand drivers. If you look at this overall on the right hand side, just from 18 to 19, and I think it's a similar trend that if you look on the left hand side, if you look further out, the overall projection of gas demand in the continent is actually expected to be flat. That doesn't mean that this is a so-called quiet or stable market, but it's the fact that there is balancing factors that keep it roughly flat. On the one hand, you see the desire in many European countries to increase the share of renewables in the market, and also to drive heavily on things such as energy efficiency, which actually pulls the demand for gas down. But on the other hand, you also see that many European countries, and pretty much all the major markets in Europe right now, have committed publicly to the phase out of coal in all the markets, so which is having a very forceful pull up of gas demand. But we see those two largely balancing out. But a very important trend that's there, and you see it just as a small red bar in the chart on the right, but this is a bar that's going to continue to increase over time. So you see the red on the left actually starting to decline quite rapidly over the years ahead, is the decrease in domestic production, which will have to be offset by imports. That's imports by pipeline, but also imports by LNG. What you see on the right-hand side this was the consensus of the market as of January. That switch from pipeline to LNG was going to be quite rapid in 2019 compared to 2018. To date, I think that is a trend that has been seen. Not sure if it will be to this degree, of course, across the course of the entire year, but it will be very much driven by the balance of prices. So to what degree, how effectively Russia will price pipeline supply into the market, and therefore allowing LNG to compete or not. Because I think it's obvious that if pipeline prices are brought down, then LNG will not be able to compete at those levels. But it's all about the balance of what the product is brought into the market in terms of the total volume of pipeline supply, not just the marginal tons. If you then look about the potential of the markets in terms of how much potential or how much can each region still take in terms of LNG, we look both at the regas capacity as well as the gas-fired power generation capacity on this chart. So on the left-hand side, you see in various countries around Asia, the gray is the amount of underutilized regas capacity in the various countries. And in the middle chart, equally, the amount of gray is the amount of gas-fired power generation capacity that is underutilized, which is showing a much lower rate of utilization than, for example, coal that is represented on the right-hand side of the chart. What's maybe the obvious summary of that chart, it is not in the near term, there is not a lot of new infrastructure required in Asia to increase the demand of LNG. The infrastructure is there, and the market is there in order to take that increased demand of LNG. That's not the same on the supply side. So that infrastructure in terms of the demand side, that picture is not as healthy on the supply side if we look forward. If you look at the right-hand side of the chart, in the last 2 years, only 21 million tons of new capacity were sanctioned. So that is, if you take 2018 is the last year in 2018 we saw only 21 million tons of projects sanctioned, and you can see the historically low levels in 16 and 17 just before that. So you can say 21 million tons is a big increase again, but demand increase was 27 million tons, as you heard me say before. So the number of new projects being sanctioned are less than the annual increase in the demand in the markets. If you look at the left, in terms of what is currently operating, the red, and what is currently under construction, is the yellow, then we see that you look kind of about where the 2018 outlook range is, then you see that there is a large, the demand forecast is the gray, so the lowest, the most pessimistic expert in the market, predicts the bottom end of that gray range, and the most optimistic expert the top end of that gray range. You see how much new supply projects have to come into the market in the next years. It means that every year the world needs to see more than 20 million tons of LNG projects sanctioned to meet that demand. By comparison, looking at Novatek, more than one Yamal LNG project would have to be sanctioned every single year in the world to meet this type of LNG demand. And take into account that every project takes 4 to 5 years to be constructed. It's not like you sanction it one and also deliver it in the same year. So maybe in summary, I think the world is rapidly beginning to recognize the role that gas is playing in the energy challenge. And as you saw, it is expected to have the largest share of energy demand growth, supplying about 40% of the additional demand between now and 2035. The clear benefits of gas in addressing air quality, as well as reducing carbon emissions, can be seen particularly in China, where switching from coal to gas has already led to a 78% improvement of air quality in Beijing over the last 5 years, if measured in terms of ppm 2.5 quality in the air. In 2018, again, we saw Asian LNG imports exceeding expectations and more than absorbing the continued supply growth. In 2019, may well be the year where we expect record supply growth of 35 million tons. But again, we do expect that the demand side, that the market will meet that supply growth this year more with a combination of Asia and Europe rather than predominantly Europe only. And as I mentioned at the end, we saw only 21 million tons of FIDs in 2018, 7 million tons in 16 and 17 combined, and that is not enough by any means in order to meet the expected demand by the middle of next decade. So maybe in summary, a couple of thoughts about what's in it for Russia. Vitaly also showed that Russia is already the largest exporter and the second largest producer of natural gas in the world. So what is the opportunity for LNG growth for such a gas colossus? I think very simply put, the world needs Russian gas in order to meet that tension of the energy transition that we see. Pipeline gas, yes, that remains without doubt, but very importantly, LNG as well. Many of the countries which are and will continue to drive demand for gas, whether India, whether Southeast Asia, Latin America, they're not in reach of Russian pipelines. And with what is today only about 5% of the global LNG supply, I think Russia is evidently underrepresented in the global LNG market, and should be aiming for a much higher market share. I think many of the projections, also from the Russian ministry, estimate an increase of about 4 times that. So that would bring, as the market also increases, would bring the market share up to 14%. But I think even that still is a lower percentage than the gas reserves, percentage of gas reserves that Russia has compared to the world. So I think even that ambition can still be set even higher. If that happens, I think it's a win-win situation where the world gets more access to abundant reserves of the cleanest of all fossil fuels. And I think this is probably the most important contribution that Russia can give to the improvement of global air quality and the reduction of global warming. And I think for Russia, as I said, it's a win-win because it will continue to make good use of its natural resources. But not only that, also its intense, strong workforce in the country and the strong industry with profound gas expertise and a highly professional workforce. My last slide, sitting here today, would be remiss of me to reflect on an important milestone that happened only a few weeks ago, which was the 25-year anniversary of the Sakhalin Energy company, and important milestone as being the first Russian LNG project. I think Sakhalin Energy has led the way for the industry, which was at the time still completely new in Russia, and has laid the foundation not only for the market, but I think also for the Russian LNG expertise in the country. Whether it is from constructions to operations, from shipping to marketing and customer relations. So building up a workforce, a contractor market and force in the market. But not only setting the path, but continuing to work on efficiency and effectiveness, having increased over that time period the capacity of the LNG plant by more than 20% without building any new trains. Although, as Vitaly said, we are all eagerly looking forward to the third train being built on top of that capacity increase. I think important that Sakhalin Energy plays a very important part in the Asia-Pacific market. Given its proximity to the market, is considered the most reliable of all suppliers, and has already last year surpassed 100 million tons of cumulative supply to its customers in Asia. I think it speaks for itself. It wasn't always easy to be the pioneer, but I think Sakhalin Energy showed itself that it was up to the task. So, just with that small little recognition at the end, thank you for listening to my presentation and to the LNG outlook of 2019 as we see it. Hopefully it was interesting, hopefully it has many starting points for our discussion later here today in terms of some of the trends we see, some that, as these are projections and expectations for the forward, I think they're all up for debate, they're all up for discussion and for challenge, and I think that's what I'm certainly looking forward to around the table here, because I think through that challenge and discussion it will make all of our expectations and forward plans more robust. So thank you for your attention.
Cedric, thank you so much. This is very comprehensive and